we've got to go back and look at, wait, they lied about the whole thing. We can't skip that part. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Wade Mullen, who is the author of Something's Not Right: Decoding the Hidden Tactics of Abuse and Freeing Yourself from Its Power. He writes and advocates to help those trapped in the confusion and captivity that mark abusive situations. So, Wade, to get us started, I know I had just said to you before we pressed record that I don't usually send people this many questions and this many notes, but there was so much in your book that was addressed in ways that I had not heard before and therefore hasn't been presented to our audience before. And so we have a lot that I'm hoping we'll get to today. We'll see how we do. But for those of you who are watching and listening, I would really stay through to the end. I think this is going to be excellent and such a great resource for you. So again, Wade, to get us started to jump in, I'm wondering if you would mind sharing a bit about how you became connected with this context, because I believe you have a personal story that kind of moved you into this area.
I do, and thank you for the opportunity to be on the podcast and share. I was at a church outside of the Philadelphia area for about 7 or 8 years. And during that time, my wife and I were both very involved in the life of the church and in ministry, particularly to youth and young adults. And it was a great experience. We grew to love the people there. The community, the faith community, was vibrant. We describe it as a time that was filled with joy. Joy was a word that we used often to describe our experiences there. And over time, and I think this is sometimes a byproduct of a community that is characterized by joy and trust and transparency, is you begin to be willing to share your stories with one another. And that's what we experienced in maybe years 5, 6, 7 of our time there, is some people began to share some of their own stories with us. And some of that included people's trauma histories. Some of that included mistreatment of all different types and abuses that they had experienced from a person who was in a position of trust in their life. And some of that needed to be reported. It needed some kind of follow-up. And so that, what we discovered was something that leadership above us at the time seemed to view as a threat perhaps to the image of the church. And there was then an attempt to shut some of those stories down. And then that put us in a difficult position of advocating for those we believed were mistreated, were abused, were traumatized. And that advocacy then put us in some harm's way as we experienced then some retaliation and leadership then seeking to shut our efforts down to try to advocate for others. And that was a very difficult 2 years. So we walked that path for about 2 years. And it took us some time to realize, it took me some time to realize that I was being mistreated. And I remember to this day very vividly meeting with an older couple who were like mentors to us. And we spent 3 hours just telling our story, not just of, okay, here's what we've done to try to advocate for others, but here's how we've been treated along the way by leadership. And one of those mentors at the end of that time just saying with righteous anger in her voice, "This is abuse." And she was describing the ways in which we were treated. And that was at the time difficult for me to wrap my head around. It wasn't the language that I was using, but it was like a light bulb going off in my own head, and it began to give me some vocabulary and some language to describe some of my own experiences, but then to recognize, okay, there's something wrong here that's happening, and this needs to stop, and there needs to be some safety, and there needs to be some healing. So walked through this in a very personal way. And so one of the things that I say about the book is that many of the tactics that I describe in the book I experienced in some way, and had to navigate those. And then at the same time that I was walking through this very difficult experience at the church, which we now look back on and say was a time filled with joy, but also filled with sorrow, especially near the end. And near the end, I had also started to research for a PhD dissertation, and I had decided to focus my PhD research on how evangelical organizations were responding to threats to their image. So they were facing a crisis of some kind, like a scandal, and that was threatening the legitimacy of the organization. It was undermining public trust in the organization. And I wanted to understand how leadership, how organizations were managing the impressions that others were forming of the organizations and its leaders during that crisis. And I had selected that shortly before things erupted in our own lives. And so this was a fascinating experience, for me, because I was going through this terrible 2 years and seeing a lot of deception, and at the same time was doing this academic research and seeing how the impression management strategies that the literature was describing being that has been used across decades in a variety of organizational settings were tactics that I was seeing used in real time by leadership that was trying to cover something up or to maintain dark secrets, and also had seen and heard victims of abuse, of all kinds of abuse, describe offenders using. And so this was just a moment in which I was seeing, okay, here are impression management strategies used by organizations that's described in the literature and in research and studies that have been done on this. And I'm also seeing these tactics happen in real time in these very difficult meetings and in communication that I'm receiving from leadership and from people in authority who just kind of want to make this all go away. So that twin experience of going through this personally and then going through it in an academic setting formed much of the material that went into the book.
I didn't realize that they overlapped in the way that they did. I'm sure that brought, gosh, such a level of reality to what you were looking into.
It did. And
Am I
uh,
Go ahead.
go ahead. It did. I mean, it gave me perspective that I would not have otherwise had. It also gave me language, which I certainly would not have had I not been doing the research. And so, for example, I was able to, at one point, respond to a leader who I believe was being deceptive and coercive, and say, here's what I believe your statements are communicating, and this is why I'm concerned. And then name that communication, actually give it a label, and say, here's what I'm concerned you might be trying to do through this communication. And I would not have had the ability to actually name that and give it some categories and describe it had I not been going through some of the academic research.
Right. And so what you wrote in Something's Not Right, this is sort of the accessible layman's version of the research for your dissertation, correct? Am I understanding that right?
Yes, the dissertation was certainly an academic uh, paper written for an academic audience. It did not bring my own personal story into it. That was still unfolding at the time. Um, and it did, though, um, it gave me some theory and some evidence based categories. It gave me like a lens. This is how I describe it. It gave me a pair of glasses to wear. And when I wore those glasses and looked at my own story, I just saw things that I wouldn't otherwise be able to see. And so the book is sort of applying that framework, that lens, to my own story, which I also learned is a story that sadly others have experienced in similar ways. So when I started writing about some of my research and some of my own experiences and describing these tactics online, I wasn't prepared for the amount of people who then were responding and saying, "Well, this is precisely my experience. This is." It was giving people, I think, some language as well and some categories that they didn't have. And so as I was receiving some of that feedback, realize, I think there's an opportunity here and a need to apply some of this theoretical uh, frameworks to real life situations, and maybe that would give people some language and some categories to be able to understand their own situation a little better.
Absolutely. One big thing that I hear from people, one big as in consistent is the word I should probably be using. So, one consistent thing that I hear from people who approach Be Emboldened is that, oh, I didn't know what that was. And so the language enables us to actually talk about it and to start the process of making sense to the best of our ability, something that doesn't actually make sense. And in that, like it's not just, it's not fair, it's not how it ought to be. But it gives us the ability to actually say, okay, this is what happened. And that's so important in us being able to start to heal and to move forward in our lives. And so, yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. We see that regularly.
Yeah, I think it's
I wanted
empowering.
to
I
that
know there is a bit of
lag.
a
That
lag,
lag's
yes.
getting us.
So, yeah,
Sorry. Go ahead.
no. I was going to say, I think it is empowering to have some language that can help you bring you out of the fog and out of the confusion. And that's why I went with this title, "Something's Not Right," just to validate that you can be at a place where you don't have any language and you don't know what to call it, but you know something's there in the shadows, something's below the surface, and all you can say maybe is, this isn't right. There's something wrong about this, and then there's this journey I think you can take to begin to put some language around that, and that can be empowering as it brings you out of that confusion and you're able to make sense of what's kind of in those shadows or below the surface that you can't quite see, but as it comes into clarity and into focus, then I think that can be really important.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Moving into our next question, what would you propose as the reason for why religious abuse can be so successful within the church?
And that's I think, an important question, and one that I've thought about a lot, one that I hear asked a lot. And I think I think it's important for reasons related to prevention, and it's one that I encourage church leaders especially to explore instead of responding to the many stories that are being shared about abuses in the church by saying, well, it's not as bad as what's kind of out there, maybe. That's a response that I've seen. But to stop and say, well, what is it about us, or what is it about this environment that might make it more conducive to abuse and the occurrences of abuse than other environments? And so I'm glad that you're asking that question, and other people seem to be asking it. I don't have all the answers to that, but some thoughts that I've explored include the possibility that there's there's a there's a great power differential that exists sometimes between leadership in a church, such as a pastor, someone in a position of spiritual authority and trust, and a congregant, and we may not fully realize or be aware of the amount of just how wide that gap is. So you have in literature and research on power and just the whole concept of power, these different power bases or these sources of power that are described. And so someone can get their power from their expertise, or they can get their power from their reputation, or get their power from their position. And there's these different bases of power. And when you look at the church, I think a pastor, let's say, has numerous bases of power from which he or she is exercising authority. I think sometimes we underestimate the amount of authority and power that a pastor or spiritual leader has in the life of somebody else. And then I think anytime you talk about power, the other side of that coin is vulnerability. And and there are numerous vulnerabilities that somebody might have. And when you're in an environment where there might be opportunities and circumstances for power to be abused in ways that exploit any number of vulnerabilities. So that could be somebody is away from their hometown. Let's say they're attending a church while they're at college, and maybe they don't have the support system that they normally would, or they might have some financial needs. They may not have the kind of resources that others have. And so somebody who's in a position of spiritual trust, or such as a pastor, who is intent on exploiting those vulnerabilities, might take advantage of the opportunities and circumstances that a church community could provide. So an example of that, let's say, is a pastor who offers to go over to a single mom's house and help her with tasks at the house, like help her with home improvement projects. Well, that is, in my estimation, a boundary crossing behavior. But the power of that pastor might be hard to question that. It might be hard to resist that, because it might be seen as just he's being pastoral. He's offering to help, and that's one of the tactics that I write about, is this over helping in ways that aren't necessary. And what can be happening in that kind of scenario is a pastor is bringing his power and authority into a vulnerable situation and exploiting that circumstance, is perhaps even engineering opportunities for there to be isolation. So my point is, I think you have this gap between power and vulnerability. And then you also have, I think, within a lot of church contexts, opportunities and circumstances where those vulnerabilities can be exploited, because there's maybe it's easier to engineer times to get people alone or in places of isolation. There can be retreats, there can be camps. There's these places and environments um, where power, I think, can be more easily abused.
Mm. As I hear you talking about this, this gap that we have between those who have the power and those who have more so the vulnerabilities and that relationship between the two. It reminds me too of just how, and I want to couch this in, this should be a good thing, everyone. Like this should be a good thing. Unfortunately, sometimes it goes awry because the abuser, whose fault it is, capitalizes on it. So it doesn't mean that this is bad that we can be this way. But especially when we're talking about in a religious community, there's sort of this benefit of the doubt environment. Well, they mean well, and we can be so quick to criticize ourselves. Well, maybe I'm just being sensitive, or maybe that's from my own past experience and I'm portraying that onto someone else and that makes me ugly and I've got to repent for it. And it's so easy to turn it on us to make it make sense in that paradigm in which we're living, which is no, like this man is serving on the Lord's behalf or this woman is serving on the Lord's behalf. And again, it's good that we wanna think of people in the best light, and yet we have to be really cautious to not discount what we might be hearing inside of ourselves, to at least say, "Okay, maybe this is my own thing. Maybe this is triggering something, and maybe it's unfounded in this situation, or maybe it's triggering something because it is familiar, and this is similar to what happened before, and I need to listen to that warning inside of myself." And so just a lot of kind of trusting and exploring and asking questions and being cautious. And but again, when I think about in the church, there can be this culture of just trust, and that can come back to bite people so tragically. And again, it's not their fault that they trusted. That's not the issue. It's the people who are capitalizing on the trust.
Yes, and that's so true that there can be this overly optimistic outlook that is perhaps taught and reinforced by leaders, and you can then have this environment where, and I write about this in the book, where there are these sacred roles, and there's this there's this caution and sometimes just outright restriction against speaking up about a faith leader's misconduct or abusive behavior because that faith leader occupies a sacred role. So, don't speak against the Lord's anointed, or don't speak against the pulpit, or something of that nature, because the role itself is sacred and it needs to be guarded. And then along with that might be these overly optimistic beliefs, that, if God has put a person in that role, then there's no possible way that person could could have done the things that people are saying he or she has done. And so I do think that's a great point. That's another thing that can make a religious environment more conducive to abuse.
Mm. What have you found to be some of the common tactics utilized by abusive religious leaders in order to achieve their goals? So, what are some of these tactics that you found the most in your research?
I like to separate the tactics into two broad categories. The first being more assertive tactics, or we might describe them as grooming tactics, where the goal
Okay.
might be to engineer some kind of trust. And then the other tactics being those that are more defensive, usually the tactics that are that are used in response to confrontation or response to exposure. But I think the most common tactics that I've seen that are more assertive, or they might be described as grooming, are these charming tactics where a person who is deceptively trying to coerce trust engages in what sometimes is called love bombing, showering people with compliments, giving gifts. I mentioned over helping, where somebody might go out of their way to help somebody that they're targeting in ways that cross boundaries. And all of this on the surface looks good, and that's one of the things that makes it hard to identify and makes it hard to resist, because they're usually meeting some kind of need that we have, um, and and sometimes what I've seen is that the abusive person has done some of the relational work to identify what another person needs, what their vulnerabilities might be, and then they offer charms that satisfy those needs, or those kind of desires that another person has. And that is the most common thing that I've seen, and that's where trust is built. Maybe the only thing that might be more common is something that's similar to charming another person, is when the abusive individual promotes themselves. And I think the goal is still pretty much the same. It's to gain trust from people and to coerce that trust. But the abusive person might exaggerate their past success, or they might talk about themselves in ways that are grandiose. Sometimes when I've engaged with people who have had a history of being victimized, and they describe when they first encountered a red flag, I've I've heard more than once people talk about how the person who victimized them was narcissistic, but communicated things about themselves in ways that alerted them that, okay, this person might not be a truth teller. So, for example, pastor who's targeting, grooming, charming somebody who is later victimized along the way says, or early on says, I haven't committed a sin in a year. Now that sounds ludicrous, but it's that kind of thing that I've heard, is this sort of self promotion. And this is different than just somebody sharing about their lives, or sharing about even about success maybe that they've had, but it's done in a way that introduces lies and deception. It's grandiose. It exaggerates things. So there's this self promotion, and then the other side of that might be this kind of similar language where another person who's being targeted is also being promoted, in a sense, is being charmed, but there's also this deception that's being attached to that. So a charm might be somebody complimenting you, but in ways that seem to be excessive, or sometimes a red flag happens when you're being complimented by somebody, but they don't really know you. So being flattered, that sense of, okay, this person is flattering me, saying so many things that sound nice, but something just seems off about this. Well, I think you have that same kind of similar language happening when somebody is promoting themselves as well. So they're flattering themselves, but they learn that works. And I think sometimes in this charming category of tactics, they're then flattering other people as well. So I would say those kind of tactics are the most common, because what they do is they coerce trust in people. So then people learn, okay, this is somebody that I want to follow, or this is somebody that I want to be close to because, well, they make me feel good and they seem to be so successful. But if that trust is just being coerced and manufactured, then sadly, what then gets introduced is this dismantling tactics that I talk about in the book as well, where and then you begin to see the other side of that person.
Mm. I hate flattery, so I'm just gonna say that first. I'm so not a words of affirmation person, but I think I came by it because of stuff like that. Because I grew up in a cult and then landed into some other situations and things, and yeah, when people wanna start acting like they see you, and that's what it'll feel like to someone who maybe had a neglectful childhood, has felt overlooked, has felt unseen, and then someone like, "Wow, it seems like they really actually see me. I feel seen and known and loved," and it feels so good, and it can be such an oily move because it's touching on a deep need that we have that should have been met in ways that it wasn't. And it's just it breaks my heart, and it's also a disgusting tactic, and so I'm glad you brought that one up. I've seen it used in my own life. I've absolutely heard it used in others. And something else I wanted to mention is kind of on it's in the same vein, but it's interesting because it comes across as kind of being the flip is I've heard people and I've heard stories of people, so of leaders who instead of telling everyone their accolades, they'll make comments like, "Oh, well, I'm just a farm boy. I'm just a," and so they'll actually say it almost the reverse, almost like they're making themselves less, but it doesn't do that because it solicits sympathy. It lowers expectations. It gives them sort of this innocence to them of like they just don't know better, so it can remove accountability. It is such a snake-like tactic, and I'm wondering, did you come across that one at all?
Yes, and thank you for speaking to that because I see that frequently as well. And interestingly, this has also been something that's been observed in the academic literature on how organizations might manage the impressions of stakeholders by using what I don't prefer this term, but it's the term that's in the literature on impression management, but by using what are called self handicapping statements or tactics in which organizations might promote their weaknesses so that if and when they are exposed or if they fail, then they have a ready made excuse for that. It's similar in which somebody, I think, identifies something that can be exploited and used in order to gain or retain trust and a following. And I think that's the common denominator is that everything is viewed by the abusive person as just material that can be used and exploited to manipulate people that they view as objects. And so I've seen situations where somebody is exposed in a church setting, a church leader, and they're maybe a celebrity pastor, and much of their communication at that time was really about how successful they are and how maybe they're like close to God and they just draw people in, but then they get exposed for their abuses and they go off, and years later they start a church and they center that church around their image still, but it's a different image. Now it's an image of being broken, of having failed and now getting second chances. And so what I am concerned that's happening there is they're still using material but now it's a different kind of material. It's about their brokenness, about their uh, vulnerability, and they're offering that kind of as something that they're trying to sell to people who maybe have experienced something similar, or that's what they're looking for in a leader or a pastor, but they've never dealt with the truth that was exposed and brought into the light years before that. So it's just it's kind of like a different material that they found that they can use to coerce trust out of people.
Mhm. Now, you've mentioned kind of these different responses that leaders will have after they get exposed. Would you mind running through those? What have you discovered to be the standard responses?
So the standard response is usually some kind of denial. And um, when you talk about denial responses, one thing that might come to mind is this acronym DARVO, which I don't believe I discuss in the book, but it's becoming more and more popular. It's coined by a professor named Dr. Jennifer Fried, and it's really good work. But the D stands for denial, the A stands for attack, and then the RVO stands for reverse victim offender. So you have this pattern of denying that the accusations are true, then attacking the person who's making the accusation. And they usually go together. So if you can convince people that, oh, this isn't true, this is all made up, or the person who's reporting this is being motivated by revenge or bitterness or something, then that sets that person up to then attack the credibility of the victim. And then what happens next is, okay, now you've reversed the roles of victim and offender. So I think that's a really helpful framework. I also have found that this denial stage, though, can have stages within itself and can take different forms. So usually there's an attempt just to offer an outright denial. Well, this didn't happen. This isn't true. But if evidence emerges and that outright denial is no longer feasible because there's no disputing that, okay, something happened, then the second type of denial that I have found that somebody might offer is this excuse, right? So somebody might say, yes, this happened, but I was overwhelmed at work. I was I was sick. I was stressed. I didn't mean to. So there's different types of excuses. So one common type is denying any ill intent. Where I didn't mean to act in this way or to cause some kind of harm. So there's different excuses. But if an excuse doesn't work, if that kind of denial doesn't work, then what I've seen is then that person move to denying that um, that the victim, if somebody's been victimized, is a true victim. So that's a phrase, sadly, that I've heard too many times as well. She's not a true victim, and what's being suggested there sometimes is, well, they brought it on themselves. They should have known not to be alone with him. That there's some kind of justification sometimes, or along with a justification might be, um, yes, this happened, but in the end, it was for everyone's good. Um, Even in very twisted ways, somebody can finally admit to abuse, but then justify it by saying that, oh, that this was something that God wanted them to do, and that this was for the good of victims. So the one thing that comes to mind is when church leaders, sadly, in some stories, have been exposed for engaging in some kind of physical discipline. and then they justify that, like harsh physical, beating people, not just kids, but beating people, and saying that that was done to purify followers and to make them more holy. So that's a kind of justification. And then if that doesn't work, then I've seen this kind of denial where someone might try to make comparisons to others and say, well, I'm not as bad as, this person over here. This abuse wasn't as bad as these other kinds of abuses, and that's what you really ought to be worried about. So what I've seen is that a denial begins usually with some kind of outright, this didn't happen. And then as that person is facing more and more exposure, then you get different types of denials that are introduced to that narrative. And that's one of the common features then of deceptive and coercive language is it's constantly shifting. Based on what the situation is, based on what the new information is, as that person who's trying to define the situation for others so they can't define it for themselves. So they're trying to escape some kind of accountability. They're constantly changing the story, and they're constantly shifting what tactics they're using in order to maintain the impressions that they want people to have of them. And so that's one of the ways in which I see that happening is people, there's some kind of confrontation or exposure, and maybe they start with just saying it's not true. Oh, then you find out, no, it is true. And here's some more evidence. And they finally admit to that, but they still have these excuses and justifications or comparisons. So those are different types of denials.
One of the things I kind of get stuck on is, and for anyone who's listening and not looking, I'm about to talk with my hands, so you may or may not miss out, may or may not be helpful. But if we have like these 2 points, and here we have, okay, denial of the action or the behavior. And then people want to skip down to, okay, well, now I've kind of been caught. Like, this isn't going to really work. This isn't going to get me off the hook. So now, like you mentioned, now we're moving to denial of the intent. But then they want to skirt over here really quick to those justifications, like you're saying. But really, what we need to do is not be diverted over to here. We need to come back to here in comparison to here. The denial of the intent in comparison to that initial denial of the behavior, the initial denial of the action. And that transition that was made, the person is already deemed untrustworthy. That's already happened, but it's like, no, don't look at here or the comparison between the two. Let's skirt over here. Let's hang out over here. We've got to back up and we need to pause longer here because even if there's room, like, I mean, if we're talking abuse, there isn't going to be much room here, but in any situation where anyone does that to get off the hook for anything, maybe there's room for grace there. There's room for the person to apologize. There can be room. But first of all, we didn't get a legitimate apology if we skirted over to my excuses for something. An apology doesn't come with excuses. And we're actually going to get to that because you share some really good information about apologies. But we've got to go back and look at, wait, they lied about the whole thing. We can't skip that part.
It's a great point. And one of the recommendations that I give, especially to leaders as they're maybe trying to navigate something like this, is to say to them, you've got to slow everything down, and that might really frustrate somebody who's trying to deceive you and sell you a story, which that will be an indicator how they respond to that attempt to say, no, let's take a time out here and address this shift you seem to have made from saying this never happened and now saying, yeah, it did, but and that's going to be a test. That's going to be an indicator of character, and really make it clear to you whether you are, in addition to dealing with, did this person act in this way, but also now, is this person telling the truth? And then you've got to address that. But I think you're right, and you make a good point that That so often is happening in that move from one type of denial to the other. And too often leadership sadly just lets it go. And you've got to do what you're saying and say, no, like, we've got to come back to this and address what happened here with this shift.
Yeah, to disallow our attention from being shifted over so quickly. Yeah, absolutely. And I want to go back to what I just mentioned about apologies because you've got some really good information in your book about what what an apology is versus what a concession is. And I think this is so important for people who are listening and watching because we hear people come to us and say, "Well, I guess they apologize," but it's like it didn't mean anything or it didn't really help or it didn't and people can feel like that's their fault. When in reality, I think you touched on why it's a concession. It wasn't actually a genuine apology. So would you mind breaking that down for people?
Yeah, and I think at any point, during this process of bringing truth into the light, however that happens, that there's got to be an emphasis on what's true, and a communication of truth, speaking the truth in love. And if somebody is trying to hold on to their image, hold on to the control of the narrative, and they're doing that in deceptive ways, offering all these different denials and excuses and justifications, what I've seen happen sadly is that that might progress until that person finally reaches a point of having to acknowledge, yes, this did happen, having to acknowledge some kind of responsibility, but they're not doing that from a place of sincerity and out of a desire to make amends and repair what's been broken, but they're doing that as sort of a last gasp effort to retain their legitimacy in the eyes of others, to retain the power that they have. So the way that I've seen it expressed sometimes is leadership, an abusive person saying, "All right, well, if if all people want is an apology, then we'll apologize. I'll apologize, and then maybe everyone will be satisfied and go away." That isn't that never leads to an authentic apology. It leads to what I call a concession. It's it's people conceding, kind of waving a white flag of surrender, and hoping that that'll just diffuse everything. And the main difference is, I think, one is in the intent, but also, as you can't always gauge intent, but you can look at what's being communicated. I think the main difference in what's communicated is whether or not you see attached to the quote unquote apology all the attempts to promote themselves, all the attempts to defend themselves, all the excuses and justifications. So usually in a concession, you might have a very short admission of responsibility, like a "I'm sorry," and then you get some of the self promotion, but this is what I've done all my life to show that this is not who I am. This is not what I'm like. Or you might get all these excuses, but you just need to understand how difficult life has been for me. Or you might get an attack, some kind of language that then turns things around and attacks the people who raise concerns. So it's not an apology. It's something else is being communicated. But because the person throws in the words "I'm sorry," they might be able to say it's an apology, and people might accept that. The other difference in communication that I've seen is when you have these conditions that are applied, usually introduced by that two letter word "if" that sadly shows up in too many apologies, especially institutional apologies, where what I've seen happen is leadership get to the point where, okay, they can't deny that, yes, people have been harmed and we need to own our responsibility. And so they get up and they make an apology, but somebody has convinced them, maybe a lawyer, that if you actually confess, then you might open yourselves up to liability. Somebody might sue you. So they say something like, if anyone was harmed, um, if we have been too harsh, or if we have mistreated people, if people have been abused. And that, anytime I see that, what I see is a concession. And because it doesn't actually name the wrongs clearly, the injuries that have been caused by that wrong, but it's leaving the possibility, the door open, that maybe this did or didn't happen, or maybe we're guilty of this, maybe we're not. But it's so sly and it's so subtle that it can appear as, okay, they've said they're sorry, but you've got these little conditions that are introduced, these little 2-letter words like if, or that little word but, and something else is being communicated other than an authentic apology.
You said something about this is in your book. You said something along the lines of compassion. It was in relation to compassion and truth. I think compassion without truth is deception. And what you're speaking to right now could be just flat out deception because it's just flat out deception. But when we talk about compassion without truth being deception, I really love this line. I think it connects with some of what you're sharing right now and what we may or may not see from someone as we're trying to reconcile. Would you mind explaining what you meant by this?
But I think one of the sad outcomes of deception, especially when you get to these stages where, let's say, somebody who's been exposed, a leader, maybe they're in a position of trust and authority, they present their narrative to people, and maybe they seem to be apologetic, but you can't actually find the truth anywhere. Nothing's really named, nothing's really identified. But it's at that point that sadly some people might be pressured into, maybe guilted into responding with compassion. And that's part of the deception, is that person who's controlling the narrative might get people to divert their attention away from those who have been victimized, those who who ought to be the object of our compassion, and instead they promote their own suffering through this. And sometimes that's offered in the context of a quote unquote apology, and then people respond or are pressured into then extending compassion to that person, but the truth hasn't been established. So that's what I mean. That if that the compassion has to be accompanied by the truth, and follow the truth, and insisting on the truth is a compassionate response. I think of um, something Alice Walker, who's best known, I believe, for writing the book The Color Purple, said in one of her interviews, or in one of her writings. She told the story of breaking something as a child, and then her dad coming to her and asking her, did you break this? And wondering as a child how her dad is going to respond if she tells him the truth. But she decides she's going to tell him the truth. She tells him the truth, and he responds with such compassion and in a way that delighted in her truth telling. And she says, that one of the lessons from that was that in telling the truth, you free yourself from the prison of untruth. And I think that's a powerful picture and way of putting it. Is that, if somebody's walking a path like this, and they're there have been accusations, and leadership has failed people, leadership has mistreated people, and there's a moment now to tell the truth. The compassionate response, I think, is to invite people to do that, even if they've tried to offer an apology, but they still haven't named the truth. To invite them to do that and insist on that as that is a compassionate response.
I can think of an example from my own story that I think what you're sharing applies to very well. My in my story, my primary story is in like, being raised in a pseudo-Christian cult. The fact that mine and my siblings' abusive leader was our father, our literal biological father, really played into the compassion piece so strongly that even though he's been gone for over 15 years now, he died quite some time ago. Some are still completely unable or unwilling to consider what's true. They're unwilling to consider the truth. And so, with me being out about the truth, speaking to the issue and sharing from my story, attempts have been made to assign the guilt and shame to me for acknowledging the truth of what's happened. But in reality, it's the truth. And the truth doesn't come without love for someone. It's just what's true. And the truth doesn't come without compassion for someone and their story of how they got to be where they were. It's the truth, though. And so I see that interplay where some people they want to give all the compassion, but they totally overlook the truth because if they do look at the truth, the compassion's going to have to be tempered by that truth because there's going to be some accountability that now has to come into play as well. And that's hard. And so I want to acknowledge that for everyone as well. Like there's a freedom. I resonate with what you said. I think you said Alice shared. There is this freedom that comes from it because we're not trying to hold things together that don't actually go together anymore. Like we're not trying to maintain this reality that we know is untrue, even if it's subconscious. And yet we have this freedom that comes, but it also can mix with some really real grief and that's a journey that, I would say at the same time we get to go on because when we lean into it and we turn towards it, we do get to really heal and do get to really rebuild. And we're doing it on something that is, again, it's based in truth. That's something I'm so thankful for in my own story.
I appreciate you sharing some of that. It is very difficult to face the truth and to tell the truth and to speak it and to say it out loud, and I think that needs to be kept in mind, and then when you're if you're in a position of inviting people into that same kind of process, it needs to be just that, an invitation and giving people a sense of, okay, yeah, this is going to be hard, and you may need support, and it may be accompanied with grief and accountability, but on the other side of that is freedom and inviting people into that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so worth it. And Wade, before we transition, or before we wrap up, it's going to seem like we maybe jumped a little bit here, but I see it all as connecting. I very much appreciated your section on cultivating beauty and something's not right. I'm wondering if you'd share a bit about how your attunement to beauty has intersected with your own healing from abuse.
Yeah. Um, it's been a journey, an ongoing journey of discovering beauty that's around me, and not just finding the beauty that's around me and entering into those spaces and activities and creating time for that, but also identifying and appreciating the beauty that's even in the midst of the heaviness, even in the midst of traumatic stories and very difficult circumstances, to to look beyond the darkness and through the darkness, and see the light that the darkness is trying extinguish and to appreciate that light, to see that beauty in the midst of that. I've learned to try to do that, and then practically, um, I've, for instance, have taken up a lot of gardening. My grandmother has a beautiful garden. Her whole life, my grandparents just cultivated a lovely flower garden at their home, and it was, I mean, their place is just beautiful. And I have over the years at our own home here grown to appreciate just the beauty of nature, but enjoy cultivating and creating environments that our family can enjoy, and that's been very therapeutic. So I think finding ways to create beauty, I think, can be very therapeutic, and that can take so many different forms. It can be crafting, it can be doing puzzles, it can be any number of things that I think can be really healing. And then, we know that connection with others is also healing as well, because so often that's what's lost when you go through an abusive situation. And so I think that for me, engaging in making things, creating things, and enjoying the beauty of that, but then also doing that together, like doing that as a family, doing something like that with friends, that also brings in that connection, and that also has been for me really healing. Um, so I think that looks different for different people, but it's learning to recognize the beauty around you, and then identifying, I think, activities that you can engage in which you're cultivating beauty, and seeing how that breathes life back into you.
Mm. Yeah, it reminds me that there's hope to be had. And not
Yeah.
just as in, as Christians are our hope fulfilled, our hope right here is like there is good to be found here. Not just in while we look for Christ's return or when we get to be with him in heaven, it's there is good here too. And I'm thankful for that. And beauty reminds me of that, the cultivating beauty, the appreciating beauty, something very restorative about it for myself as well. And I agree with you, it can look so different. My husband actually really connects with like Christian rap music, which is just so not where I find beauty.
Yeah.
And he's like, "Why do you love nature so much?" And it's like, gosh, it's just the beauty. There's something transcendent about it for me. Like, I don't know. He's never
Mhm.
said rap music was transcendent to him, so I don't want to put words in his mouth. But yeah, it can look so different for each of us. And I loved that in your book when I got to that section, like, oh, there's something I think just very deep within us, that beauty, whatever form it takes, can speak to. And it reminds us that, yeah, there's some good here and there's some hope here. And I think it encourages us forward in our journeys.
Yes.
To wrap us up, Wade, I want to go back to what you said about, I didn't have words for it. You didn't have words for the abuse and how, we often hear this. And that alone can be a huge barrier, of course, in our ability to make sense of what we've been experiencing. Then once we have that language, we begin to heal and rebuild. So as we look to give ourselves permission to speak those words aloud, that speaking aloud can become another barrier. And so as we're navigating these steps, again, whatever they look like exactly for someone else, what encouragement would you give to somebody who's listening to this conversation and is just finding their words?
Well, I think that if you're beginning to find words, then that tells you something. I want to validate that. That I think if that tells you that I believe there is something there. There's something that's being communicated to you. There's patterns, and you're beginning to actually name them. Is to keep following that, and the way that you might do that is perhaps to begin to write things down. So I know one thing that has been helpful to me in the past at different points is to take an inventory of what I've experienced, begin to just write it out, and that can be difficult, and that's not always something that a person might be in a place that they're able to do. But that can be validating in and of itself, because then you're putting, it's forcing you to put words down on paper and then to actually see that laid out can result in this message that's kind of being sent back to you that no, you have every right to be angry, to be upset, or it's no wonder why your life might feel like it's falling apart right now, because look at what you're going through. And then also would encourage people to see if there's somebody else that you can um, communicate that story to, somebody who's safe. Could be a professional therapist or a counselor, somebody, or a trusted friend, somebody who will allow you to begin to communicate and express those words, even if they don't make complete sense at the time, or it's fragmented, or it's fractured, and allow you to do that in a way that isn't rushed. That can be hard to find, but that can be really healing and empowering and validating, to actually sit with another person who can be a compassionate witness to your story and allow you to tell it and share it, and then perhaps give you some insights, some perspectives, some strategies for moving forward. So that would be another encouragement that I would offer.